Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Richard Cohen, the author of Making History, the Storytellers Who Shaped the Past. He's written 4 books. He's a former publishing director and has written for the New York Times Book Review. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Cohen.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Who gets to write down what we remember? And how does the person who writes it influence not just the rest of us, but people who aren't even born yet? I'll use my favorite historian to get us going, Robert A. Caro. I've read every word he's ever written on Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson. And sometimes I think to myself, do I know Lyndon Johnson, the person, or do I know Lyndon Johnson as described by Robert Caro? Not to suggest he's inaccurate, but how would a different writer have told the same story? And how does a historian influence our own truths? So Richard Cohen, why is it important for us to distinguish between the two, the difference between knowing a person and knowing a person as described by someone else?
Well, I'm going to come back to you maybe later on about people who write down their record of the past, because one of the points about my book is we get our history from all kinds of different sources, movies, works of art, tapestries, paintings, statues, but that's not an answer to your immediate question. And the answer to that question is a really important one, and it seems so simple, but history means 2 different things. It's both the past and people's accounts of the past. In other words, when we get our history from any of the means I just listed, it's through a filter, it's through somebody else's vision of it. And we don't always distinguish between those 2 senses of the word. And it's crucial that we should, because every person who gives us their version of the past, it's their version. It's colored by their prejudices, their agendas. And I kind of made a list before I started the book of all the various pressures you could have. You know, pressures of patrons, pressures of needing to make money, religious beliefs, political beliefs, love affairs. Voltaire's longtime lover, who was a great scientist, hid Voltaire's first work of history, took it away from him when he wasn't looking, because she didn't approve of him writing history. He should be a scientist. So you've got all these different agendas. Bad health. Some people write about subjects, and their writings, wonderful writings they can be, are slanted by their own physical disabilities. So one's got to approach any sense of the past, any reading of the past, with that, not cynicism exactly, but taking a measure of suspicion about what the person is about.
One of the opening quotes in your book is, "Before you study history, study the historian." When and how did you decide that we must further study some of the most famous people who ever lived in order to understand the world that we all live in?
Well, it started very early, though I didn't take advantage of the revelation early. I was at my high school, and listeners listening to an overeducated English accent, I was sent to an all-boys school about half an hour from Bath in southwest England, and immediately, aged 13, dumped into a class that was studying medieval history. And the special paper, which I was meant to take when I was 16, was in the dissolution of the monasteries. And I learned that the person who'd written the books, more than one volume, on that subject was a man called David Knowles, who was a Regius Professor of history at Cambridge in those days. And his view of the dissolution of the monasteries was the monks had it coming to them. They were dissolute, they were greedy, they didn't go by the rules of their various founders at all. And then I learned, in my kind of dim teenage way, that this author, David Knowles, was actually a monk, and he'd been a monk at the abbey that ran my school, which was run by Benedictine monks. And he had tried to foment a rebellion at the abbey and been parceled out to a small priory in the southwest of London, and then started writing. And when his book came out, he was, almost being drummed out of the order. People said, but he's the great new medieval historian of our time. So the abbot and the heads of the Benedictine order said, oh, well, maybe we can't drum him out because we'd rather want to boast that he's one of ours. But anyway, all of this, to my, as I say, untutored mind, I thought, boy, he was writing his books with a real agenda, because he'd been saying to the young monks who he tried to get to join in his rebellion, look, the abbot and the senior monks have lost their way. And he took that agenda to writing about religious life in England and Wales. And he is a wonderful historian who most people won't have heard of, let alone read. But he was a prime example of how a person's personal prejudices, right or wrong, can shape the way they write.
Why does the current moment demand a book like this, examining the historians themselves?
Well, I'm far too selfish to say the current moment needed a book like this. I just felt I wanted to read a book like this, and it doesn't exist. I mean, some very good books on what history is and what it does, although I try to avoid being boringly academic. I think the word historiography comes in the book about once, maybe twice. I wanted to read the book, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to write it myself. And it took the best part of 10 years. I can say more about the process if you want, but it was then that, when the book came out, and just 3 weeks or so ago, that I realized it had suddenly become topical, because so many leading figures and so many kind of main issues in papers and magazines were concerned about how we take in the past, how we form our ideas about the past. I mean, last November, the New York Times had on its front page, President Xi of China declares that he will rewrite China's history. Don't see him doing it all himself, but anyway, under his aegis. And he wants a new lot of historians to shape China's history according to his diktat. 2 weeks later, President Putin, and this is before the invasion of Ukraine, declared that he was shutting down Memorial, which was the main organization in Russia for keeping records of things like the Gulag camps and so on, the worst travesties of Stalin. And Putin declared that he was going to make sure that Russia's history was written as a glorious history, and that the bad parts of the history were expunged or in very small type.
And so history is just really political right now.
Well, in America, you've got the same split. I mean, you either got at one level Donald Trump, when he was president, destroying important documents, destroying things that should tell future generations what the history of his time was like. Or you've got the country divided over what kind of history should be told, whether it's critical race theory or the 1776 commission that Donald Trump set up. The nation is split about what the past should be.
You say in your book, the book is titled Making History. You say that history in your title could have been in parentheses. What did you mean by that?
British irony, I suppose. That just history as a word needs the kind of unpacking I've been starting to describe. That it's not even that we get history seen through the eyes of people who have their own drum to beat, their own agenda. I mean, some of the best works of history have been highly prejudiced accounts, and all the better for it, as long as we know that they are prejudiced. It's also that history, as taught in schools, colleges, universities, and so on, the academy, the academics' way of writing about history, giving it to us, is not the only way that we ought to take in history, or even necessarily the best. I mean, I mentioned books about the nature of history. I have included in my book, which previous books generally don't at all, a chapter on historical novelists, a chapter on the Bible, a chapter on Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare, of his 38 or so plays, more than half are histories, and we get our views of the 14 Plantagenet kings and queens, as well as the ancient Romans like Caesar, Mark Antony, the woman they loved, Cleopatra, Coriolanus, from Shakespeare. So Shakespeare would never have described himself as a historian, but he's one of the people who has hugely influenced our knowledge of history.
You were inspired, and we are going to get to some of those people. I have a quick rapid fire round where we're going to run through some of those folks, not too rapidly. But before we get there, I want to ask, you were inspired by a man named John Burroughs, who you quote as saying, all historians, except the very dullest, have some characteristic weakness: complicity, idealization, identification, to name just a few that you listed. How is it and why is it that the good ones have a fatal flaw, have a weakness?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Because they're human beings. In other words, it's not as if being a good historian requires that they should also have a flaw. It's just that all human beings come to whatever books they write, movies they make, whatever form, in this case, a sense of the past comes down to us, becomes available to us, tinged with the life they've lived. I mean, one of the people, when I was working as a publisher, John Keegan, who I think is a marvelous military historian, really changed the boundaries of what military history could do and how it should be written. He, when he was, I think, about 11, and was struck down by tuberculosis in his hip, I think, originally. And that literally shaped his life. And although in large part he recovered from it, he spent years in a hospital undergoing a fairly barbaric way of treating tuberculosis patients then. And he was in a ward for a lot of that time with infantrymen from the Second World War. And the fact of his own injuries, diseased body, and what he learned from those squaddies, not officers, changed his life. And he knew that he would never be able to fight in a war. He was too injured to do that. He applied to do national service in Britain, and the doctors he was seeing just laughed at him. So he had a really romantic notion of what being a soldier was like. But allied to that, he'd got from the conversations he had with these older men on his hospital ward a sense of what war at the sharp end was like. These were men who'd fought in the trenches, who'd fought hand to hand. And he'd been brought up and remained throughout his life, a Roman Catholic, a moral view on what war was like, what it was like to fight in a war, that absolutely dictated the way he wrote and gave it a kind of moral backbone a lot of people who write history don't necessarily have. And so those awful years were the making of him, and they're what made the way he wrote.
How much thought did you give to the question of what becomes history and what doesn't become history? You say that it comes down to influence. You use that word in the book. Surely all of our lives make some history, either by voting or buying a house or having a child. At what point does a historian say, this must be highlighted in an article or a book?
Well, it depends what motive they're going to. It may just be an intellectual motive, if you can have a pure intellectual motive. But you're right. I could be coming to see you for a coffee and say, you'll never guess who I bumped into walking along the street. There was Lady Gaga. And I saw, anyway, whatever it might be. And I'm telling a story. I'm selecting and shaping an account. I am telling you my history, my, maybe half an hour ago history, but it's still history. So all of us are historians in one way or another, to one extent or another. What makes us choose to, as it were, go public takes us back to the various motives, political, religious, probably as far as writers are concerned, the need to make money more than anything else.
An amazing story is a good motive too, right? To make someone remember something that happened to you.
Yeah, sure.
Has that ever happened to you, by the way? Run into Lady Gaga on the street?
Every day. But you don't necessarily have to trust my account. And one of the great issues in all this is it possible to be an objective historian, an objective giver out of the past? I asked the great British historian, Eric Hobsbawm, whether it was possible to be objective. And he was pretty well to his dying day a declared Marxist. And he just laughed at me. And he said, no, of course not. But, he added, I try to obey the rules. Now, what did he mean by the rules? Trying to tell the truth, going to primary sources, sifting the evidence, talking to as many people as you can. I mean, one of the things about, how one should approach somebody's account of history is to make sure you read more than one account. A good teacher at school or college will say, well, here's this history of the American Civil War, but here's another one which has a totally different viewpoint. Read both and make up your own mind.
I had a teacher in school, in journalism school, who said that if objectivity isn't possible, then what are we all doing here? We should all just give up.
Well, that's presuming, as I said, that objectivity
is achievable.
It's achievable. I quote in my book a couple of lines from a Tom Stoppard play. Two journalists, foreign correspondents somewhere, and one of them says, well, my paper, it's objective. It's trying to get the facts. And his friend says rather cynically, yeah. But is it objective for or objective against?
I have a quote I want to read to you from page 6. James Baldwin wrote this: history does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. What did he mean by that?
Oh, it rewards such a lot of unpacking. But I think I would just say this: whether I've come around to your house for a coffee and you're about to use yesterday's old coffee, and then you have a memory of your mother saying, you must always try to be the best kind of host you can be. Never give someone stale coffee. Well, that may be maternal admonition or advice, but it's also a piece of history that is shaping the way you behave. On a less personal, private way, you carry with you a whole range of memories about the past from things you've experienced and things you've read. So that, for instance, you might meet a person who is an American native, and you'd think of the books or accounts of how American natives were appallingly treated by other Americans as they moved west, and how you reacted to that person, what you said to them, would be formed by that reading, so that the past, and this could be multiplied by thousands and thousands of other examples, shapes the way you think, the way you behave, it shapes your emotions.
How does history change over time? When do we decide what is important to pass down or to erase? The word I'm putting in quotes, because if something isn't passed down, it's not necessarily erased. It's just not recorded for someone else to hear. So what did you discover as you did your research for this book and you did your writing for this book about how history changes over time and what is important to one generation of people, but not necessarily important to another generation of people?
In order to make reading the source notes at the end of my book more fun, I've reprinted a number of cartoons about history and historians, which make a point, each of them. And one of my favorites shows the king on his throne, and he's turning to a courtier, and he says, I'm worried about my inheritance. Kill all the historians. I'm worried about my legacy. I'm sorry, kill all the historians. And I think, and again, this is not something I started the book knowing or feeling, but I feel it strongly now, that history, in the sense of as complete as we can get it, the phrase I'll return to, as we can get it, is under attack and is fighting for its life. Because throughout the world, you've got dictators, and that's not just Xi and Putin. Those in power are trying to shape history according to the way they want it. And that can be of an immediate kind. One thinks of the lies that is coming out of the Kremlin over what's been happening in Ukraine, or going way back in time. The kind of great myths that each country erects for itself in order to give itself a character and something to be proud of. People hate those myths being under attack. What? Robin Hood wasn't a real person? There was a poll taken in England fairly recently, 3 or 4 years ago, of school children, and they said, well, of course, Robin Hood was a real person and King Arthur was a real person. Winston Churchill, no, fantastic life, obviously made up. So what people think is true and what they don't think is true is quite something. I read another poll not long ago that 43% of Americans think that Elvis Presley is still alive.
43%?
I wouldn't like to say where most of those were found. I remember when I was in high school, my history teacher, who was a marvelous man, a Benedictine monk, gave us an essay subject. Geography is the palimpsest of history. Palimpsest meaning layer upon layer. And that as people invade other countries, take over other countries, boundaries change, nations contract or extend. So facts of geography affect our understanding of history.
How far back did you go? Let's get into some of the meat of the book here. And I'm going to reveal my lack of advanced. I have a college degree, but maybe not super advanced college degree like a master's or something like that. So I may not pronounce these folks' names right. How far back did you go? The names are Herodotus and Thucydides.
Don't worry.
Does anyone know that? I guess someone does.
I think I do, but I'm probably wrong. I normally get people's names wrong.
Thucydides?
Thucydides and
All right.
Herodotus.
I got it. Okay. Who are they? How did they do history back then?
I'm inclined almost to say they discovered it. I mean, you don't automatically have an interest in the past. And before Herodotus, who flourished around 400 BC, not much television around then, there were chronicles, very dry chronicles, but people didn't use their judgment to interpret the past or write it up in really interesting stories. And Herodotus, who lived, as it were, if you looked at a map, he was in a bit of Greece, really, that was Turkish. So he's a bit of an outsider. And he spent a lot of his main years just traveling around, and then wrote up what he'd discovered, the people he'd met, and what he'd learned about the past, in a book that is translated now as being called The Histories, but academics say it's more accurately called The Researches or The Inquiries. And Cicero, who of course came sometime later, an ancient Roman, called him the father of history, because he created this interest in history, in the study of the past. A later Roman, Plutarch, said, well, actually Herodotus made so much of it up, I'm going to call him the father of lies. And so both those sobriquets have come down to us over the decades. But, you know, having an interest in the past isn't natural automatically, but it's prerequisite if a civilization is going to advance. And that takes us back to Baldwin's point, really. Having a knowledge of and an understanding of other people who've lived long ago helps us in all the judgments we have to make, public as well as private. So anyway, Herodotus was followed by Thucydides, and also a different kind of exile. He'd been a general in the Greek army and had not been a successful one, and had been thrown out, he'd been fired. And so he went back to his country estates. He came from a rich family and decided to write a history of the Peloponnesian War, which was the Great War where the Greeks had suffered a terrible defeat, and try to make sense of that defeat. That was his agenda, if you like. And his kind of writing of history was very different from Herodotus's. Herodotus gave us gossip, gave us stories which he thought he knew were fantastical. Men with no heads, except they had eyes in the middle of their stomach, flying snakes. He said all Egyptian men's semen was black. I don't think he was necessarily a racist, but he's just so proud of being Greek that he thought other peoples were lesser in some ways, and almost spectacles to be recorded. And Thucydides hated that way of writing history. He felt that you should be as true to what you knew and what the evidence was as possible. And although he thought that, his great book on the war is made up of speech after speech. Did he have somebody writing it all down whom he discovered? No, he made it all up. And he said, well, I'm trying to be as accurate as you can. You know, I really feel that if they didn't say it, either they should have, or maybe they said something like it. So I'm not saying that he was like Herodotus, whose fantastic streak is far broader. Broad streak, yes, I think you can have a broad streak. But he also gave himself license to create the past as he thought it was.
And do these books survive? How do we know what they wrote?
Well, one historian now dead about 100 years, a man called Burns, says, what we know of the ancient world. So ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient wherever. Remember that Africa had universities long before Herodotus was writing. What we know of those times is the equivalent of a really badly bombed out building. Take Mariupol building with, hardly a wall standing. That's, as it were, the metaphor for our knowledge of those days, which is pretty frightening when you think of it. And, Herodotus and Thucydides have come down to us in very few sets of their manuscripts, because going back to the king who said, kill all the historians, various leaders and I'm thinking of Augustus Caesar, for instance, didn't like certain works of history and banned them from libraries and did all they could to make sure that particular scripts, particular historians, didn't survive. The work of Catullus wouldn't have come down to us if they hadn't been found being used as a bottle cork, bottle stopper in someone's cellar. So a lot of the time, it's a matter of luck who survives and who doesn't.
The Bible, 25 million copies a year just in the United States. 25 million. What publisher, right, wouldn't kill to make to have a book like that and sell 25 million copies of it? 2 Harry Potters per year until the end of time, every year, 2 of them. 40 authors, 3 languages, 1,200 years it took to write it, you say. You say it's like the formation of a geological strata, as if we could open up humanity like the crust of the earth and see the settled layers of dirt and rock. So, who wrote the Bible? Who are those 40 authors? What is it? Did the people who write it leave behind other writings that give us a clue as to what we should do with the current document that we call the Bible?
Well, I limit myself to the historical parts, what I call the historical parts of the Bible. I don't have the knowledge to write about every single one of those authors, but the account of how, say, the first 5 books of the Bible got written, got edited, got mixed together is like a mystery story. And I would be testing the patience of your listeners if I tell the whole story, but I show that it is mainly the work of 4 separate writers writing at different times, and a redactor or editor who had to decide what to put in and what not. And sometimes, as readers of those sections of the Bible will know, includes what were called doublets, 2 versions of the same story. But it's a wonderful account in terms of the ingenuity of the people involved. But it also refers back to what we were talking earlier about what people want to accept and are forced to accept, in the sense that for hundreds of years, the Christian and the Jewish religions held sway over what people in countries where those religions were paramount could say about the past. And I mean, I was brought up, despite having the most Jewish of names, Cohen, I was brought up as a Roman Catholic, Irish Catholic mother, and sent to a Catholic school. And even then, this was in the 1960s, although people said, all right, we'll accept that we can't take the Bible literally, although, of course, many Christians still do take the Bible literally, all right, I suppose we can't have the death of Moses as having been written by Moses because he was dead. We'll grant you that. Biblical scholars, let alone believers who didn't have great knowledge, wouldn't accept that the Bible, as my chapter on it explains, is very largely a work of propaganda. And inch by hard-fought inch throughout the 19th century and on up to the present day, biblical scholars have had to accept the fact that the Bible is full of history and fascinating history and important history, but it's not a historical account. And
so what is it?
It's a mixture of fictions, songs, ballads, poetry, axioms.
Did the people who write it, the 40 authors, did they intend for it to be taken literally? Did they intend for it to become the Word of God?
Well, you're rolling up the 40 authors as if they're a homogenous
Right,
group.
one guy, right? One group
And,
sitting around a conference table.
and, you know, their motives and their backgrounds were so different. And remember, the Bible itself is a translation of a translation. So it's a very odd object, this super best-selling book. And people had a whole range of, as I say, not just backgrounds, but of motives in terms of what they were doing. But the historical section, what I call the historical section, was an aid to belief, to encourage belief. And as such, you can choose other words to propaganda, but centrally, that's what it is. And therefore, when one reads it, you've got to realize that by saying it's propaganda, one's not saying the Jewish faith or the Christian religion is false. What you are saying is, oh, so there was no King David that we can historically, with absolute confidence, say existed as portrayed in the Bible. When we talk about a kingdom or other kind of key words that suggest large areas, we've got to realize that the actual words used in the Bible could often mean just a village or a few straggly houses. And the other great thing is, you know, it's in the last 100 years mainly that we've learnt from anthropology and archaeology a whole range of facts about the ancient world at the time that the Bible was written that force biblical scholars to revise what their views have been. So it's, goodness, in terms of, you know, different versions of history, it's a prime example of how we've had to realign or rethink our understanding of the past as new knowledge has come through to us.
And it was not taken literally, you say, until the early 1900s, 1910.
Yeah. And, you know, you will find large parts, I mean, the literal reading of the Bible really started in the South of America. And it's the southern states where that reading is still promulgated. And even where it may be that a certain amount of rethinking has happened, only a little. So, you know, if anyone in the south of the states is listening to this podcast, you can expect some pretty angry replies.
But why did it start to be taken literally around the time of the 1910s? What happened?
It's such a powerful document, and it's a great succor. It helps people get through their lives if they can think of it as being not myth or propaganda or ideologically shaped fact-giving. I don't know enough about the history of Southern religious gatherings, but apart from anything else, it portrays Christians as the winners, as having, I could say the same of Jews, except that the Jewish faith doesn't attempt to convert people. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't look for converts in the same way that the various branches of the Christian religion does. But I know that I'm getting into hot water here, and people have to read my chapter on it to see how I give evidence to my arguments.
Well, let's cool things down a little bit then. Shakespeare, was he a writer of great plays, or is he a historian?
One of the things I learned in writing this book is to have a real hatred of labels, historian particularly amongst them. What is a historian? Well, it's not necessarily everybody is a historian in relating what's happened to them. we want to give historian a certain weight, and we can come back to the person who pioneered history as a university subject or an honorable thing to spend one's life involved with. But Shakespeare, he has told us, as I said earlier, more about certain characters than any other person. Our Richard III, which incidentally was the most popular play in Shakespeare's own time, is Shakespeare's Richard III, this hunchbacked, murderer of princes, villainous figure who we love even as we hate him. We may not say, I totally believe that is what he was historically like, but I think emotionally we do. We sign up to it. The kind of grand, bellicose, heroic Henry V of Agincourt, that's Shakespeare's Henry, because he was a propagandist, like the writers of the Bible. He wanted to push the Tudor cause, the Tudor version of the past, and all his plays, while they do 101 other things, were political tracts. At one point, just after 1600, people say he suffered a mental breakdown. Then there was James I coming in after Elizabeth I, and he changed or adapted his political thinking to the new monarch. So there's political movement within his writing. But he, as much as any of the historians we're talking about, was a historian. He's given us a sense of the past, but he is a historian with an agenda, with prejudices, and indeed patrons whom he had to please.
I'm going to jump around a little bit because we have limited time and I want to get to a couple of more topics. So we're going to gloss over huge portions of the book. I want to ask, though, about the Civil War next. One of the quotes in your book is that before the Civil War, America had no history. How did the Civil War become the ultimate American tool for historians to seize on and start to tell stories about what our country is as a nation and as a people, some of whom who have very competing viewpoints?
When you say you want to talk about the Civil War, as if there's only been one Civil War that's either ever been or is worth talking about. And people might disagree with you. And I want all listeners to your podcast who may not be Americans or may not live in America to know that there had been others, which isn't just me teasing you. It's the fact that, whatever you call your local
the Civil
group,
War,
the Civil War, you want to adopt the history which is most becoming to you, in two senses of becoming. You want to feel, if you're from one of the states in the United States that fought on the South side, that the war was a Union power grab, that the southern states were fighting to protect their land, their way of life, that the enslaved peoples were happily going about their lives under a kind patriarchy. And people said after the Civil War and books, the American Civil War, I'll adopt your shorthand.
The Civil War.
When books started coming out, that the North may have won the war, but it was the South who won the peace, because so many of the first 60 years worth of books coming out about the Civil War extolled the Southern version of what the war had been about.
It is funny that in America we call it the Civil War, and we assume everybody else does too. There have probably been thousands of them over the course of world history. Memoirs are an interesting topic that you just discuss in your book. Your chapter is subtitled From Julius Caesar to Ulysses Grant. My question about memoirs is I seldom read them. Maybe only one per year do I read a memoir. Are memoirs garbage? Can they be trusted to tell us accurate history or even history at all?
Well, remember, I've said that no work of history, which you would accept as a work of history, should be trusted entirely. And memoirs, by their very name, are what one person remembers. And it's going to be a more personal account and a more limited account than a larger work of history. When Dean Acheson was writing his book of memoirs, Present at the Creation, which was a huge bestseller at the time, because he was Democratic presidential candidate and the rest, he sent one section to a friend of his and said, well, this is an important meeting I was part of, and I want to make absolutely certain I've remembered it straight, because historically it's significant. And his friend wrote back and said, Dean, you've got it absolutely right. The quotations, I was there, you've got right, the atmosphere, the whole details of the meeting. The only fault is you weren't at the meeting. So, people are going to be, even though they may try to make up for it, at the mercy of their memory, at the mercy of even notes they've taken at the time.
And they have huge agendas too, in portraying themselves in a certain way.
Yes, absolutely. One's hardly ever come across a memoirist who recounts a story in which they come off badly. Sometimes they do, and then it's a kind of second thing. If I put something in that shows me coming off badly, people will sympathize with me the more over the whole of the book. But memoirs, they're obviously not garbage, but it may be that the level of suspicion that one takes in reading them goes up a bit, simply because they're personal accounts.
How do we handle the first drafts of history? You do have a chapter on journalists. As we read, and this is an important question for people today, because there's so much debate about what journalism is trustworthy and which journalism isn't. How should we think about these first drafts of history, and who is writing them, and how do we think more deeply? What questions should we ask of the authors of our articles and our tweets and our blog posts and all the things we consume on a daily basis?
Well, our understanding of the past or of particular events is healthily a series of readings and rereadings. Any professional historian who writes a book about a particular event in the past is going to be saying, well, this book is justified because all previous historians haven't got the complete picture or have got parts of it wrong. They're saying that past historians are inferior in their understanding to their book, their understanding. So to that extent, each new account of the past is criticizing previous accounts. And one of the problems now is that in the time of false news, in the time when you've got dictators shutting down so-called objective tellers of the past, newspapers, magazines, television programs, archives, it's harder and harder to get a sense of what we should be doing to get history straight. Not completely straight, but to get a sense of what isn't false news and what is valid news. A journalist is there at the time. So to that extent, they're more often than not eyewitnesses or people who have interviewed eyewitnesses. And that gives their accounts a particular value. But it also means that they're limited by both the context in which they're writing. If you're in the middle of a war zone, you don't necessarily know much about what is going on even a few streets away, let alone hundreds of miles away. And you're also limited by not being able to test some of the things which your witnesses have told you. But in another way, in his Pulitzer-winning work of history, which is in fact the first volume of his diaries, Henry Kissinger says early on, one of the things about being alive and present about something that you're telling the history of is you were there, you know what happened. Now, one can actually question whether one necessarily does know all that happens, even at events that you're present at. And certainly that's true of my memory and limited powers of observation. But in that way, he's importantly right in saying a crucial truth about journalists. The first draft should have things in it that people who compose the second, third, umpteenth draft find valuable, because it's the raw facts.
Why are we so into this? Our futures are so uncertain. The world seems so on edge to so many people at times. Why are we so into history? Why do I have all these books next to me here? Why do you have all those thousands of books sitting in your room right now that I can see over our Zoom conversation? Why are we all so into what happened before we got here?
Samuel Johnson, the great Dr. Johnson, said, "Why are we interested in stories?" His story, her story, any stories. He said, "Is to fulfill ourselves." And history, by nature of it having to come through to us as something selected and shaped, hence my subtitle, is full of stories. And we love stories to fulfill ourselves, and part of that is we're searching for the truth. We love fictional stories because they tell us truths. We love the best historical stories because they tell us a different kind of truth. And this is me being extremely pedantic. English pedants are the worst. We're in a struggle at present, as I said, between power and history. We're in a struggle for the truth, to be able to hang on to the means by which we can learn the truth. And that's why history is so important, and why we've got to be responsible for its health, and why we've got to defend it.
Is history done better today than it was, and I'll use quotes, back then? Do we do a better job of it, of telling stories? Has our society advanced to the point where a history book that we pick up is worth reading?
I think every age has an amazing degree of arrogance.
Right. We know more than they did.
The English, and the English writer C.S. Lewis said, the people who lived in the Middle Ages weren't that different to us. We've just got better dental hygiene. It's an interesting question, which I put to Simon Sharma, who may be my favorite living academic historian, if that's a decent phrase for him. And he said, look, I don't think you're going to get any better writer of history than Fernand Braudel, the wonderful French historian, whose 2 volumes on the history of the Mediterranean under Philip II of Spain are maybe, well, they've never been bested before or since. And Braudel, who was writing in the 40s and the 50s, a lot of his book he composed while a prisoner of war in Germany during the Second World War. He wanted to be a novelist originally. Before that, he wanted to be a doctor. So the doctor's powers of diagnosis and analysis, and the novelist's powers of imaginative putting yourself in another person's shoes, are part of Braudel, and what made him wonderful. On the other hand, what Braudel didn't have was the internet, or Google, or Wikipedia, or email. So access to a whole range of information at the press of a button was impossible in his time. Now, that can be dangerous as well as useful, but the fact that if you're writing a work of history, you can get a friend's view, an expert's view. You can check facts, you can check judgments, you can look up articles and books so easily, means that we've got a range of tools that writers of the past would never even have dreamt of.
What impact does making money have on that effort?
Well, I realize that you run your podcast on a totally altruistic basis and that money isn't important. But, Machiavelli wrote The Prince and his works of history, which aren't as well known, but are still wonderful works, as job applications. He was not well off. He lived in a kind of small holding in Italy. And he deeply needed a job and the money coming from it to get by. So his works of history were directly the result of his wanting some cash. And it's pretty.
So does that help the history that is written, or does it make it so that the person writing the history is targeting the book in a way that can start to shape the content in an unhelpful fashion?
Well, it helps the history in the sense that you really want to meet your deadlines, imposed or not imposed. I mean, it helps the books get written, otherwise no pay. Whether you write your history, I don't know the extent to which people who write history have an ideal reader in their mind who they feel they're writing for. The person who will understand all and maybe forgive all, or forgive all the faults of the historian writing anyway. But certainly most people have a sense of whether they're writing for the Tudor court and the Tudor monarch, that if they write something that court and monarch won't like, then their lives may be in danger. Solzhenitsyn, who I would say has influenced our understanding of history more than any other novelist. His account, his volumes on the Gulag Archipelago, as well as other novels like First Circle and Cancer Ward, give us a view into Soviet society, which was a direct attempt to say Stalin has sold you, to use your phrase, a load of garbage, that he was a campaigner. I don't think money came into it, though, of course, he earned a great deal of money by his writing. And when he is able to collect the loot from being a Nobel Prize winner, he didn't give it all to charity. But it was, at best, a secondary motive.
Do our digital footprints help or hurt historians? Take me, for example. On the one hand, 90% of everything I've ever written, maybe 95%, is perfectly stored and is not going to degrade based on weather conditions and all the rest, and it can't be burned in a fire and all the other things that could burn, a box of documents in the 1800s. But the other side of that is that you can't find that anywhere. Only I have the password. So how concerned should historians be, and historians lovers of history be, that we now have all these giant digital footprints that are essentially inaccessible to those who may want to do research someday?
I had some friends who were in the British Foreign Office and were posted to Moscow over 30 years ago. And they had in the flat in Moscow above them, the flat above them, some KGB spies who were listening to every single word that went on in their flat. And every week, Claire, the wife, would see this middle-aged couple coming downstairs with a huge black bag that each of them were carrying, full of tapes from the previous 7 days. And Claire said, who's going to listen to that stuff? How are they going to sort it out? Work out whether anything we've said is any more valuable than, Raymond, would you please undo the dishwasher, or whatever it might be. One does think with the facilities for documenting what's happened, digital history and so on, have we got too much? I find now there's too much I want to read in terms of magazines and newspapers flooding in every week. I can't get through it all. It becomes less a means of informing myself or a pleasure than a kind of duty I have to get around to. So, that's one side of things. And I know that professional historians would go on for hours about the various problems that the digital age has brought forth. But I remember talking to a person who was one of the main people in New York responsible for selling people's literary estates. And he went up to the farm where Arthur Miller lived. And one of the outhouses where Arthur Miller kept all his old papers had been burnt down. And Miller took him to another outhouse, and they started going through things. And Miller, in the first instance, would look at a bundle of stuff and say, "Oh, that we don't have to bother about that," or "This we really ought to keep." And he came to a bundle about 6 inches deep, tied together with a piece of string, and he said, "No, I don't think that's going to be of any interest." And the estate seller said, "Oh, what was it?" And he said, "Oh, it's just the letters that Marilyn wrote to me during our courtship." And the estate seller said, "Arthur, I think you might think again." And one's got this sense of a whole range of things which have never been digitalized, let alone put in an archive and so on and so forth, which are out there of real value, still waiting to be found. And at least the modern use of recording things has saved a lot of those things. I mean, think of, a friend of mine was given the job by the BBC of digitalizing all their old programs. And some of them have been lost or been destroyed or aren't in a state really to be worth keeping. And think of what we've lost.
Yeah.
You could say hooray for the digital age and horrors of digital age, and a good argument on both sides of the case.
If these are the people who shaped the past in your book, and certainly as you admit in the book, you've left many, many people out. This is all that could fit into one volume. How can we predict who is going to shape the future?
Well, we do know that people have this yearning to find out about the past. We do know from the James Baldwin quotation, how important an understanding of the past is in our personal lives. And we use that, all of us, to shape the future in one way or another. We also know that all the arguments going on now, which are so topical over Facebook and LinkedIn and the host of other ways in which we record our thoughts and our memories, how should that be patrolled or policed? What is the place of censorship? Sometimes it seems very obvious, censoring hate speech. Maybe Musk would say, as he takes over one of the most important platforms there is, we should have absolutely no censorship at all. But depending on how we answer those questions, that's going to shape our future.
Richard Cohen, the author of Making History, The Storytellers Who Shaped the Past. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Check out the book. Check out his Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Richard Cohen author. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.